Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who can destroy us completely. Family bonds run deeper than blood, deeper than reason, and sometimes deeper than what's right. In the Colorado Rockies, Jacob Thorne lives alone on his mountain. For 8 years, he's survived winters that kill weaker men and outlaws who fear his reputation. When his sister Clara appears after a decade apart, her words shake him to his core. She wants to stay and help him survive the wilderness. But her promise carries a meaning that goes beyond family loyalty. What does she really offer him, and what will it cost them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine, branches like ghostly fingers, as Jacob Thorne stepped onto his cabin's weathered porch. At 34, his face bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. 8 years of mountain solitude had carved him into something harder than the granite peaks surrounding his domain. His father's hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, rested against his shoulder with the familiar weight of both protection and burden, the last tangible piece of Samuel Thorne's legacy. Jacob's routine never varied. Check the snares, tend the smokehouse, scan the valley approaches for unwanted visitors. The Rockies demanded respect, and those who forgot that lesson rarely lived to repeat their mistakes. He'd built his reputation on being both fair and deadly, a combination that kept most trouble at arm's length. This particular October morning felt different, though he couldn't name why. The air carried a bite that spoke of early winter and something else, a tension that made the horses restless in their makeshift corral. He'd learned to trust such instincts. They'd kept him alive when lesser men had become food for wolves and coyotes. His cabin sat strategically positioned where 2 mountain paths converged, offering clear sightlines down both approaches. The structure itself was a testament to practical survival. Thick log walls, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned for defense rather than view. Every board, every nail had been chosen and placed with the understanding that up here, your home was your fortress. The memory hit him without warning, as they sometimes did. Clara, at 14, her dark hair braided down her back, helping their mother tend the vegetable garden behind their family's farm in Kansas. She'd been fearless even then, catching rattlesnakes with her bare hands and laughing at Jacob's horrified expression. Their father used to say Clara had more sand than most grown men, an assessment that proved tragically prophetic. That was before the fire. Before everything changed. Before he'd fled west with nothing but guilt and his father's rifle, leaving behind a sister he'd failed to protect and a family name he could no longer bear to carry in civilized company. Jacob pushed the memory aside and focused on the present. Survival demanded absolute attention to the here and now. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when winter approached, and the Garrett brothers had been making increasingly bold moves into his territory. Word from the trading post suggested they were planning something, though what exactly remained unclear. The Garrett clan controlled the lower valleys with an iron fist wrapped in false respectability. 3 brothers who turned claimed jumping and cattle, rustling into a profitable enterprise, protected by bought judges and intimidated witnesses. They left Jacob alone, mostly because the cost of removing him exceeded the value of his remote holdings, a calculation that might change if they grew desperate enough. He was checking the last snare when he heard it, the soft whistle of amazing grace carried on the morning wind. Only one person had ever whistled that hymn with such perfect pitch, turning the sacred melody into something hauntingly beautiful. Jacob's blood turned to ice water in his veins. When he turned toward the sound, she was there. Clara stood at the tree line 50 yards away, as if she'd materialized from the morning shadows themselves. She was no longer the 14-year-old girl from his memories. 24 now, she'd grown into something that took his breath away and terrified him in equal measure. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, longer than he remembered. And her clothes, worn leather pants and a heavy wool coat, spoke of hard travelling and harder living, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held a weight that made his own troubles seem small, a depth of experience that no 24-year-old should possess. These were not the bright, fearless eyes of the sister he'd left behind. These belonged to someone who'd seen the very worst of what people could do to each other and had somehow survived it. "Hello, Jacob." Her voice carried across the distance with the same musical quality he remembered. But underneath lay something new, a steel that hadn't been there before. "Been a while." He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The Winchester felt suddenly heavy in his hands, and for a moment he wondered if this was some fever dream brought on by too many lonely nights and too much mountain whiskey. Clara took a step forward, then another, moving with a fluid grace that suggested she was as comfortable in the wilderness as he was. When she drew close enough for him to see the small scar above her left eyebrow, new since he'd last seen her, he knew this was real. "You're taller than I expected," she said, stopping just out of arm's reach. "And you need a shave." The mundane observation broke something loose in his chest, and he heard himself laugh, a rusty sound he barely recognized. "Clara, Jesus, Clara, how did you find me?" Wasn't easy. Took 3 years of asking the right questions to the wrong people. She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You've been hiding well." "I haven't been hiding. I've been living. Same thing sometimes." She glanced around at the cabin, the cleared space, the defensive positioning that any experienced eye would recognize immediately. "You've built yourself quite the fortress up here." "A man needs to be prepared." "Yes, he does." Something in her tone suggested she spoke from hard-won experience. "Jacob, I need to tell you something about that night. But what happened after you left?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd spent 8 years trying not to think about that night, about the choices he'd made and the sister he'd abandoned. "Clara, no, let me say this." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the wood smoke in her hair, the leather of her clothes, and underneath it all, something uniquely her that he remembered from childhood. "You thought you failed me. You thought leaving was cowardice. It was. It was survival. For both of us." Her hand moved to touch his arm, a gesture so familiar and yet so charged with new meaning that he nearly pulled away. "What you don't know is what I became after you left. What I had to become." Before he could ask what she meant, she continued. "I've been searching for you, Jacob, not to punish you, not to drag you back to face what we ran from. I came because I need you, and because I think, I hope, you need me too." The morning sun had burned off the mist now, revealing the stark beauty of the high country in all its unforgiving glory. Standing there with Clara, Jacob felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up in a spring river. Dangerous, necessary, inevitable. "Stay for coffee at least," he heard himself say. "We can talk." Her smile was nothing like the innocent expression he remembered from their childhood. This smile held secrets and promises, and the kind of knowledge that came from walking through fire and emerging changed. "I was hoping you'd say that." As they walked toward the cabin together, Jacob noticed how she moved, aware of every shadow, every sound, every possible threat. She'd learned to be careful the same way he had, through necessity and pain. Whatever had happened to his little sister in the years since he'd left, it had forged her into something as dangerous as it was beautiful. The Winchester felt lighter in his hands now, as if sharing its burden had somehow lessened its weight. He pushed open the cabin door and gestured for Clara to enter first, noting how she instinctively scanned the interior for threats and exits before stepping inside. "It's nice," she said, examining the simple but well-built furnishings. "Practical. It serves." She turned to face him, and for a moment they simply stood there. Brother and sister, strangers and intimates, separated by years and united by blood that ran deeper than time or distance. "Jacob," she said softly, "there are men looking for me. Bad men. By coming here, I've brought trouble to your door." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that ends with people dead." She met his eyes without flinching. "I won't lie to you. I've done things, terrible things. But I did them to survive, and I did them to find my way back to you." He set the Winchester against the wall beside the door, close enough to reach, positioned so Clara couldn't grab it without him knowing. Old habits, but looking at his sister now, he wasn't entirely sure who she'd become in their years apart. "Tell me," he said simply, and as the morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado Rockies, Clara began to speak, her voice steady and her eyes never leaving his face, telling him about the years of darkness that had led her back to the only family she had left in this world. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the promise that this winter would be unlike any other Jacob Thorne had faced. But for the first time in 8 years, he wouldn't face it alone. Whether that would prove to be salvation or damnation remained to be seen. Clara settled into the rough-hewn chair beside his table, her movements economical and purposeful. She'd kept her coat on, Jacob noticed, ready to run if necessary. Smart. He poured coffee from the pot that perpetually simmered on his stove. The bitter brew, strong enough to wake the dead. "You remember how Papa used to take us hunting?" she asked, accepting the cup with hands that bore calluses he didn't remember. "How he'd make us sit still for hours, just watching, learning to read the forest." "I remember." Jacob took the chair across from her, noting how she positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and the window. "You hated sitting still. I learned to appreciate it later." She sipped the coffee without wincing at its strength. Patience became a survival skill. There was something in the way she said it that made Jacob's chest tighten. "Clara, what happened after I left? Where have you been?" She stared into her cup for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes held a distance that spoke of places he couldn't imagine. "Kansas burned, Jacob. Not just our farm, the whole territory. Bleeding Kansas, they called it. Pro-slavery settlers, abolitionists, men who used politics as an excuse for murder. I heard some of it. In Denver, men talked about the troubles." "Troubles," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's a gentle word for what I lived through. After you left, I stayed with the Hendersons for 3 months. Good people, God-fearing people." Her voice hardened. "They died screaming when Quantrill's raiders came through in '63. Jacob felt his blood chill. William Quantrill's Confederate raiders were legendary for their brutality, men who'd crossed the line from soldiers to savage killers. "Clara, I was 16 when they took me." She met his eyes steadily, as if daring him to look away. "I won't burden you with the details of what they did, what they made me do. But I learned things, Jacob. I learned that mercy is a luxury only the strong can afford. I learned that sometimes the only choice you have is between dying on your knees or living with blood on your hands." The coffee turned to ash in Jacob's mouth. His little sister, brave, innocent Clara, had been through hell while he was learning to trap beaver and mine for gold. "How did you get away?" "I killed 3 of them." Her voice never wavered. "Slit their throats while they slept. Took their horses and their guns and rode west. I was 17 then, Jacob, 17 years old, and already a killer." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of confession and the ghost of the girl she'd once been. Jacob had seen violence, dealt it when necessary, but he'd never heard such cold acceptance in anyone's voice, especially not from family. "The years after that were hard," Clara continued. "I did what I had to do to survive. Worked in saloons when I could find honest work. Other things when I couldn't." She paused, letting him understand her meaning. "Men look at a woman alone on the frontier and see opportunity. I learned to make them see danger instead." Jacob's hands clenched around his cup. The thought of Clara, his Clara, enduring such things while he built his peaceful mountain sanctuary felt like a knife between his ribs. "Why didn't you try to find me sooner?" "Because I wasn't ready. Because I was still becoming who I needed to be." She leaned forward slightly, and he caught a glimpse of something metallic beneath her coat, a gun, worn low and positioned for a quick draw. "I spent 5 years learning to fight, Jacob. Really fight. Not just survive, but win. I found teachers in places you wouldn't expect. An old cavalry scout who'd lost his family to Apaches. A Chinese gunfighter who'd fled the railroad wars. A woman in Nevada who could put 6 bullets in a playing card at 20 paces. The pieces were coming together now, painting a picture of his sister that was both magnificent and terrifying. You became a gunfighter. I became what I needed to become. Clara's smile held no warmth. And when I was ready, I started looking for you. 3 years, Jacob. 3 years of following rumors and bribing telegraph operators and tracking down every Samuel Thorne who'd fled Kansas after the Troubles. Samuel Thorne is dead, Jacob said quietly. Has been for 8 years, I know. But Jacob Thorne lives up here in the high country, and Jacob Thorne is who I came to find. She reached across the table and touched his hand, a simple gesture that sent electricity through his entire body. I came because you're the only family I have left, and because there are men hunting me who won't stop until I'm dead. Before Jacob could respond, she continued, There's a sheriff down in Colorado Springs named Coleman. He's got paper on me for killing 2 of his deputies and a town marshal in New Mexico. They were trying to arrest me for something I didn't do, but they wouldn't listen to explanations. So you killed them. They drew first. Her eyes hardened. But Coleman doesn't see it that way. He's offered $500 for me, dead or alive. That's enough money to bring some serious trouble up this mountain. Jacob absorbed this information, his mind already working through the implications. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years. It would bring bounty hunters, desperate men, killers who wouldn't care about the truth, only the reward. There's more, Clara said. The Garrett brothers have heard about the bounty. Word is, they're planning to collect it themselves, use the money to buy more land and political influence. They know about you, Jacob. They know we're family. The mention of the Garrett brothers changed everything. Jacob had maintained an uneasy peace with them for 3 years, built on mutual respect for each other's territory and firepower. If they thought they could profit from his family, that peace was over. How do you know about the Garretts? I make it my business to know about threats. Clara's hand moved unconsciously toward her hidden weapon. I've been watching them for 2 weeks, learning their patterns. They're planning to move before the first snow, when the passes get dangerous. They figure to take me and collect the bounty, then kill you to claim your land. Jacob felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the feeling he got before violence became inevitable. They're welcome to try. This isn't a joke, Jacob. There are 7 of them, all experienced killers. Thomas Garrett served with Sherman in Georgia. He knows how to wage war. So do I. Jacob stood and moved to the window, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. Nothing moved except wind-stirred branches, but that meant little. The question is, what do you want me to do about it? Clara joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. I want you to let me stay. Let me help you prepare for what's coming. Together, we can handle anything the Garretts or Coleman might throw at us. And after? What happens when the snow melts and spring comes? She turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. I don't know. But I know I'm tired of running, Jacob. I'm tired of being alone. This place, she gestured around the cabin toward the mountains beyond. This feels like home. The first real home I've had since we were children. The weight of decision pressed down on Jacob like a physical thing. Accepting Clara's presence meant accepting the trouble that followed her. It meant war with the Garretts and whoever else came hunting. It meant changing the careful, controlled life he'd built in these mountains, but it also meant having family again. Having someone who understood where he came from, who shared the memories of better times before the world turned dark. Someone who wouldn't judge him for the things he'd done to survive. You can stay, he said finally, for as long as you want. Her smile transformed her face, and for just a moment he caught a glimpse of the sister he remembered, bright, fearless, full of life. Thank you, Jacob. I promise you won't regret this. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Jacob wondered if that was a promise either of them could keep. But watching Clara move around his sanctuary with growing familiarity, seeing how she instinctively secured the perimeter and checked sightlines, he realized that perhaps regret was less important than having someone to share the long mountain winter ahead. Outside, The wind continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the sky. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 8 years, Jacob Thorne was not alone. The rifle leaned against the wall where he'd left it, his father's legacy waiting patiently for whatever darkness might come. But now it would defend more than just one man's solitude. It would defend family, blood, and whatever complicated emotions were already beginning to stir between a brother and sister who'd both been changed by their separate journeys through hell. Winter was coming to the Colorado Rockies, and with it a reckoning that would test every skill they'd learned and every bond they'd forged. But as Clara settled into the life Jacob had built, both of them sensed that the real test wouldn't come from external enemies. The real test would come from within, from feelings that had no name and desires that had no right to exist between siblings, who'd found their way back to each other against all odds. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Jacob. Clara moved through his routines with an ease that suggested she belonged there. Yet her presence changed everything. She rose before dawn to check the snares, her footsteps silent on the cabin floor. She knew which boards creaked and avoided them instinctively. She cooked with ingredients he'd forgotten he had, turning his simple provisions into meals that reminded him of their mother's kitchen. But it was the small intimacies that unsettled him most. The way she hummed while working, the same melodies their mother had favored. How she sat in the evening light, mending his clothes with stitches so neat they seemed to mock his bachelor attempts at repair. The unconscious grace with which she moved around his space, never crowding him, yet somehow making the cabin feel smaller and more alive than it had in years. On the 3rd evening, she found the gold locket. Jacob had been outside splitting wood when he heard her sharp intake of breath from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and was through the door in seconds, hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. Clara stood beside his bed, holding something delicate in her palm. The locket, their mother's locket, caught the lamplight and threw tiny golden reflections across the log walls. He'd forgotten he still had it, buried beneath old letters and maps in the wooden box under his bed. "You kept it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kept a lot of things." He approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. "Probably too many things." Clara opened the locket with trembling fingers, revealing the tiny daguerreotype portrait inside. Their mother's face, young and hopeful, gazed back at them across the years. Martha Thorne, who died believing her children would grow up safe and innocent, who'd never imagined the darkness that would claim them both. "She was so beautiful," Clara murmured. "I'd almost forgotten." "You look like her, especially around the eyes." Clara's laugh held no humor. "Mama never killed anyone. Never had to choose between survival and virtue." She closed the locket with a soft click. "This belongs to someone I used to be. It belongs to my sister. Then and now." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither dared examine too closely. Clara looked up at him, and Jacob saw something in her expression that made his chest tight, a vulnerability she'd kept carefully hidden since her arrival. "Jacob, I need to tell you something. About why I really came here." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Jacob's blood turned cold. No one came up the mountain after dark, unless they meant trouble. Clara moved with liquid speed, the locket disappearing into her coat as her hand found her gun. "How many?" Jacob was already at the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains. 3 riders. Coming up the eastern trail. Garrett's. No, these men I don't recognize." He grabbed his father's Winchester from beside the door. "But they're armed for war, not conversation." The riders emerged from the tree line, 50 yards from the cabin, their horses snorting in the thin mountain air. Even in the growing darkness, Jacob could see they were professionals, the way they spread out to cover all approaches. How they kept their weapons ready, but not obviously threatening. The man in the center called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Jacob Thorne! We need to talk." "Talk from there," Jacob shouted back, not showing himself at the window. "My name's Coleman." Sheriff Coleman from Colorado Springs. I'm here about your sister. Clara's face went white. He found me. We've got the cabin surrounded, Coleman continued. But we're not here for a fight. Send the woman out, and you can go back to your quiet mountain life. Jacob felt Clara's hand on his arm, her touch burning through his shirt sleeve. I won't let them take me, Jacob. I'd rather die up here than hang in some town square for killing men who deserved it. The fierce determination in her voice stirred something dangerous in Jacob's chest. This was his sister, his blood, his family. These men had no right to her, no claim on her life. What's it going to be, Thorne? Coleman yelled. $500 says you make the smart choice. Jacob moved to the door, keeping the Winchester ready. The woman's under my protection, Coleman. You want her, you'll have to go through me. That's not smart, mountain man. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Clara appeared beside him, her own weapon drawn. 2 of us! The sight of her standing there, ready to fight beside him, sent something primal coursing through Jacob's veins. This was how it should be, families standing together against the world, protecting what mattered most. Last chance. Coleman shouted. Send her out or we come in shooting. Come ahead, Jacob called back. But some of you won't be riding home. The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Coleman's voice, harder now, stripped of false courtesy. Your funeral, Thorne. The first shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass fragments across the floor. Clara dropped below the sill, returning fire with a precision that spoke of hard-won experience. Her bullet took one of Coleman's men from his saddle, the impact spinning him like a child's toy. Jacob kicked open the door and stepped onto the porch, the Winchester speaking its deadly language. His shot caught the second rider center mass, the man's scream echoing off the mountain walls. Coleman wheeled his horse, firing wildly as he retreated toward the trees. This isn't over, Thorne. More men are coming. You can't protect her forever. Another shot from Clara's gun, and Coleman's horse stumbled, throwing its rider hard against a pine trunk. The sheriff rolled, came up running, and disappeared into the forest shadows. The sudden silence was deafening. Gunsmoke drifted across the clearing, mixing with the smell of blood and fierce sweat from the horses. 2 men lay motionless in the dirt. Their lives ended in seconds of violence that seemed to stretch for hours. Jacob looked at his sister, really looked at her. She stood in the doorway, her weapon still trained on the tree line, her face calm as a church statue. No trembling hands, no shock, no regret. This was a woman who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. We need to move the bodies, she said matter-of-factly, and check what they were carrying. Coleman will be back with more men. As they dragged the corpses away from the cabin, Jacob found himself studying Clara's profile in the moonlight. She worked efficiently, searching the dead men's belongings with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this many times before. $600 between them, she reported, holding up a leather pouch. Good horses, better weapons. Coleman's serious about that bounty. Clara, Jacob caught her arm as she reached for one of the rifles. What you were going to tell me. Before they came, she straightened slowly, her dark eyes unreadable in the pale light. It can wait. We have more immediate problems. No, tell me now. For a long moment she was silent. Then quietly, I didn't find you by accident, Jacob. I didn't spend 3 years searching just because you're my brother. What do you mean? Clara looked toward the mountains, toward the endless expanse of wilderness that had sheltered them both. I mean, I've been in love with you since I was 16 years old. And I came here not just for protection, but because I can't live without you anymore. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Everything shifted, tilted, realigned itself into a pattern he'd sensed but refused to acknowledge. The way she looked at him, the electricity when their hands touched, the feeling that she belonged here in ways that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with something deeper, more primal. Clara, I know it's wrong. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I know it goes against everything we were taught, everything decent people believe. But I've been to hell and back, Jacob. I've seen what passes for virtue in civilized places, and the only pure thing left in my life is how I feel about you. The confession hung between them like a loaded gun, dangerous and irrevocable. Jacob stared at his sister, this woman who'd fought beside him, who'd killed for him, who'd just shattered every moral boundary he'd tried to maintain. "We can't," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt like lies, "can't we?" Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the gunpowder on her clothes, the warmth of her skin. "Who's going to stop us, Jacob? God, we're already damned. Society. We're already outcasts. Family? We are family. The only family either of us has left." Before he could respond, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. "I've killed 12 men, Jacob, 12. I've done things that would make angels weep. But I've never felt anything as pure as what I feel for you." The touch of her hand shattered his remaining resolve. 8 years of loneliness, 8 years of believing he was beyond redemption, 8 years of building walls around his heart, all of it crumbled in that moment. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and falling into damnation at the same time. She tasted like salvation and sin, like the sister he'd lost and the woman he'd found. Her arms came around him with desperate strength, as if she could hold them both together against the world's judgment. They broke apart, breathing hard, staring at each other in the moonlight. The line had been crossed. There was no going back now. "We're going to hell for this," Jacob whispered. Clara's smile was sharp as a blade, beautiful as a deadly flower. "Then let's make it worth the trip." In the distance, an owl called its hunting song to the night sky. The dead men lay where they'd fallen, testament to the violence that had brought Jacob and Clara together. And somewhere in the darkness, Sheriff Coleman was regrouping, planning his next move against the siblings who'd chosen each other over salvation. The locket lay forgotten in the cabin, their mother's innocent face gazing blindly at a ceiling that would soon shelter sins she could never have imagined. But for Jacob and Clara Thorne, innocence was a luxury they'd both lost long ago. What remained was love, twisted and forbidden, but stronger than law or morality. And if the world wanted to condemn them for it, the world was welcome to try. But first, it would have to survive them. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Jacob woke to find Clara already dressed, standing at the window with coffee steaming in her hands. She'd braided her hair back in a practical style that made her look younger, more like the sister he remembered. But the Winchester leaning against the wall beside her told a different story. "Coleman's still out there," she said without turning around. "Saw him moving through the trees about an hour ago. He's watching us." Jacob pulled on his boots, muscles protesting from the violence of the night before. 2 men dead because of choices he'd made, because of family he'd chosen to protect. The weight of it should have bothered him more than it did. Let him watch. He won't try anything alone. Clara turned then, and he saw the tiredness in her eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from years of being hunted. More will come. Men like Coleman don't give up, especially when there's money involved. They ate breakfast in relative silence, the easy rhythm of the past few days replaced by something more charged, more aware. Every glance carried weight now. Every accidental touch sent electricity through both their bodies. The kiss had changed everything, made the impossible suddenly, terrifyingly real. Clara found the wooden cross while cleaning up the dishes. It had fallen from a shelf during the gunfight, landing behind the water basin where Jacob hadn't noticed it. She picked it up with careful fingers, examining the simple carving their father had made during their last winter in Kansas. "Remember when Papa made this?" she asked. "You were 14, complaining about having to sit through Sunday service." "I remember." Jacob watched her trace the crude lines with her fingertip. He said faith wasn't about the building or the preacher. It was about what you carried in your heart. What do you suppose he'd think about what we're carrying now? The question hung between them like an accusation. Samuel Thorne had been a God-fearing man who'd taught his children to honor family above all else. But he'd never imagined that family might mean this. "I don't know," Jacob admitted. Maybe he'd understand that love takes different forms in different times. Clara set the cross on the table between them, its shadow falling across the worn wood like a judgment. Or maybe he'd say we've lost our way so completely that we can't tell right from wrong anymore. Before Jacob could respond, a new sound reached their ears, the distinctive whistle of someone approaching through the forest. Not the random call of a bird, but the deliberate signal of a human trying to announce peaceful intentions. Jacob was at the window instantly, Clara beside him. A lone figure emerged from the tree line, hands visible and empty. The man was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the wilderness. His clothes marked him as Native American, buckskin pants and a wool shirt, long black hair braided with feathers and beads. "Running Bear," Jacob said, recognition flooding through him. "He's a trader, harmless." "No one's harmless," Clara replied, but she moved away from the window. Jacob opened the door and stepped onto the porch, keeping his movements casual but ready. "Running Bear, you're early this season." The Cherokee trader smiled, revealing teeth stained by decades of tobacco and mountain coffee. "Winter comes early this year. The animals know it. Smart to trade now, before the passes close. What brings you up this way?" "My place isn't on your usual circuit." Running Bear's dark eyes shifted to the cabin's interior, where Clara remained hidden from view. "Word travels fast in the mountains, Jacob Thorne. Word about gunfire in the night. Word about a woman who fights like 10 men. Jacob felt Clara tense behind him. "Just some claim jumpers who didn't know when to quit. Claim jumpers." Running Bear nodded solemnly. "Yes, that must be it. Not bounty hunters. Not lawmen from Colorado Springs. Just claim jumpers who happened to carry federal badges." The old trader knew more than he was letting on. Jacob could see it in his expression. Running Bear had survived 40 years in these mountains by knowing everything that happened in his territory. Information was more valuable than pelts or gold. You have something to say it plain. I have something to trade. Running Bear reached slowly into his coat, producing a folded piece of paper. "Information for information." Jacob accepted the paper, unfolding it carefully. His blood chilled as he read the official wanted poster, complete with an artist's rendering of Clara's face and a description of her crimes. "Where did you get this?" "Colorado Springs. Posted yesterday, along with notices that Sheriff Coleman is forming a posse. 20 men all armed with federal authority." Running Bear paused meaningfully. "They plan to be here within the week. 20 men. Jacob's mind raced through the implications. Even with Clara's skills, even with his knowledge of the terrain, those odds were impossible to overcome. "What do you want in return?" "I want to know about the woman. I want to know if she's as dangerous as they say." Clara stepped into the doorway then, her presence immediately commanding attention. Running Bear's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. "You're her," he said simply. "The ghost woman. The one who killed 6 men in Taos without taking a scratch." 6. Jacob looked at Clara, who shrugged. "I may have understated my history slightly." Running Bear studied Clara with the intensity of a man evaluating a fine weapon. "The tribes tell stories about you. Say you move like smoke, fight like thunder. Say you're either blessed by spirits or cursed by them. What do you think?" Clara asked. "I think you're the most dangerous woman I've ever seen. And I think your brother is a fool for harboring you." Jacob stepped forward, anger flaring. "Watch your tongue, old man." No offense intended. Running Bear raised his hands peacefully. "But 20 federal men will not be deterred by reputation or fear. They come for blood and bounty. This mountain will not protect you." Clara moved to stand beside Jacob, her shoulder touching his arm. The contact sent warmth through his entire body, a reminder of everything they now had to lose. "Then we leave," she said quietly. "Tonight, before they arrive." "Run where?" Jacob demanded. "How far do you think we'll get in winter with 20 men tracking us?" "As far as we have to go." Running Bear watched this exchange with interest, his weathered face revealing nothing. "There is another option," he said finally. "What option?" "The old mine, 2 miles up the north face. Abandoned for 10 years, but the tunnels run deep. Enough supplies cached there to last a winter for 2 people. Very defensible position. Jacob knew the mine, had explored it once years ago when he'd first claimed this territory. The entrances were hidden, the passages complex enough to confuse anyone unfamiliar with their layout. "It could work. Why are you helping us?" Clara asked. Running Bear's smile held secrets. "Because I know what it means to be hunted for things beyond your control. And because I have no love for federal marshals who think badges give them the right to destroy anyone they choose." He paused, then added, "Also because I think you two have something worth protecting. Something rare in this hard country." The way he said it suggested he understood more about their relationship than should have been possible. But native wisdom often saw truths that civilized people preferred to ignore. "We'll need supplies," Jacob said, making the decision. "Food, ammunition, medicine. I can provide what you need. But it will cost." "How much?" Running Bear glanced between them, his expression unreadable. "All the gold you have cached here. And a promise." "What promise?" "That when this is over, you'll remember who helped you. There may come a time when I need similar assistance." Jacob looked at Clara, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They were committing themselves to a winter of hiding, of living like hunted animals in the depths of the earth. But the alternative was separation or death. "Done," he said. Running Bear nodded approvingly. "Gather what you can carry easily. Leave everything else. I'll meet you at the mine entrance at sunset with supplies." As the trader melted back into the forest with the same silence he'd used to approach, Jacob and Clara stood together on the porch, looking out at the mountain that had been his home for 8 years. "No going back now," Clara said softly. "No going back," Jacob agreed. "Are you afraid?" She turned to look at him, her dark eyes steady and sure. "Not of hiding, not of running. Not of 20 federal marshals or Sheriff Coleman or anyone else who wants to hurt us. What are you afraid of?" Clara reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "I'm afraid that when this is over, when we've survived whatever's coming, you'll decide this was all a mistake. That you'll look at me and see only the sin instead of the love." Jacob brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture would have been brotherly once. Now it carried the weight of promises no proper family should make. "Then you don't know me as well as you think," he said. "Because I've already decided. Whatever we are, whatever we become, I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." The wooden cross lay forgotten on the table inside, its carved surface reflecting nothing but shadows. But outside in the mountain air, 2 souls who'd found each other against all odds, prepared to face whatever judgment might come. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the harsh beauty of the wilderness that would soon become their sanctuary and their prison. Somewhere below, 20 armed men prepared to climb toward them with ropes and guns and federal authority. But Jacob and Clara Thorne had something more powerful than law or numbers or righteousness. They had each other, and love that had been forged in fire and tempered by blood. It would have to be enough, because in less than 12 hours, they would disappear into the mountain's heart, leaving behind everything they'd been to become something new, something dangerous, something pure, something that would either save them or damn them completely. The choice had been made. Now came the reckoning. The photograph was tucked between pages of Clara's journal, forgotten until she was packing her few belongings for their flight to the mine. When it fluttered to the cabin floor, Jacob bent to retrieve it without thinking, then stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Their family, whole and happy, stood frozen in sepia tones. His father's strong hands rested on their mother's shoulders. Clara, perhaps 8 years old, grinned gap-toothed at the camera, while Jacob, already tall for 12, tried to look serious and adult. The edges were torn, the surface cracked, but their faces remained clear, untouched by the darkness that would eventually claim them all. "I didn't know you still had this," Jacob said, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. Clara took the photograph with careful fingers, studying faces that belonged to people they'd once been. "I stole it from the house before the fire. Thought it might be the only proof we'd ever existed as a real family. We're still a real family, are we?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "Look at us, Jacob. Look at what we've become. Killers hiding in the mountains, planning to disappear into the earth like animals. Is this what family means now? Before Jacob could answer, she continued, her voice growing harder. I've been thinking about what happened last night. About the kiss, about what I said to you. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe some lines shouldn't be crossed no matter how much we might want to. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. After everything, after choosing her over law and morality, after committing to a life as fugitives, she was having second thoughts. Clara, no. Listen to me. She moved to the window, putting distance between them. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that what I feel for you is love. But maybe it's just desperation. Maybe it's just two broken people clinging to the only familiar thing in a world that's tried to destroy us. Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. Is that what you think this is? Desperation. I think I don't know the difference anymore. Clara's reflection in the glass looked haunted. I think I've been alone so long that I'd convince myself of anything to avoid being alone again. The admission hung between them like a blade. Jacob stared at his sister's back, at the rigid line of her shoulders, and realized she was terrifying herself with the magnitude of what they'd almost chosen. You want to know what I think? He moved to stand behind her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. I think you're scared. I think you've survived by never letting yourself want anything you couldn't fight for or kill for. And this, what we feel, can't be won with a gun or a knife. Clara turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What if we're making a mistake, Jacob? What if we're about to destroy the only good thing either of us has left? Then we destroy it. Jacob reached up to touch her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. But we destroy it together, as family, as whatever we choose to be. Because the alternative is spending the rest of our lives wondering what if. For a moment, Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Then she pulled away, moving toward the door with sudden urgency. We need to go. Running Bear will be waiting. And Coleman's men could arrive earlier than expected. Jacob watched her pack the last of their supplies with mechanical efficiency. Her walls rebuilding themselves with each item she secured. The vulnerable woman who'd confessed her fears was disappearing, replaced by the hardened survivor who'd killed 12 men. But the photograph remained on the table, forgotten in their haste, 4 faces from a simpler time, abandoned like everything else they were leaving behind. The journey to the mine took 2 hours of careful climbing through treacherous terrain. Clara moved like a ghost through the rocks and scrub pine, her footsteps silent, even on loose stone. Jacob found himself studying the way she navigated the darkness, how she instinctively chose the safest path without seeming to think about it. Where did you learn to move like that? He asked during a brief rest. Apache tracker in Arizona territory. Taught me that the mountain will tell you everything you need to know if you listen properly. Clara's voice was distant, professional. Also taught me that the first rule of survival is never let anyone know all your capabilities, even family. She looked at him then, moonlight catching the planes of her face. Especially family. Family can hurt you worse than enemies because they know exactly where to aim. The words stung because they carried truth. Jacob had spent 8 years believing he'd failed his family, abandoned them when they needed him most. Clara had spent the same years believing her family had abandoned her to face hell alone. Trust, once broken, was harder to rebuild than bodies or homes or lives. Running Bear waited at the mine entrance as promised, a pack train of supplies arranged with military precision. The old trader worked without conversation, his movements economical and sure. Jacob had the impression this wasn't the first time he'd helped fugitives disappear into the mountain's depths. Food for 3 months, Running Bear reported quietly. Ammunition, medicine, tools for basic repairs. Oil for lamps, extra blankets, even some books to help pass the winter. Books? Clara seemed surprised by this consideration. Long winter nights require occupation for the mind. Otherwise, people trapped together begin to think too much, argue too much, sometimes hurt each other. Again, Jacob sensed the trader understood more about their situation than he was saying. But Running Bear's discretion was part of his survival, like his ability to move unseen and appear when needed. Federal men arrived in town this afternoon, Running Bear continued. 23, not 20. All armed, all determined. They plan to surround your cabin at dawn, but they'll find nothing but cold ashes and empty rooms. How long do we have before they find this place? If you're careful, if you leave no tracks, maybe never. This mine has been forgotten by all but a few old-timers. The Cherokee used it as a sacred site before the white men came for gold. The mountain keeps its secrets well. Running Bear handed Jacob a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Maps of the tunnel system. Study them well. There are 3 entrances, 2 of which connect to natural cave systems that run for miles. If you must flee, you can emerge far from here without being seen. As they moved the supplies into the mine's depths, Jacob caught Clara studying the tunnel walls with professional interest. The passages had been carved by men desperate for gold, following veins that twisted deep into the mountain's heart. Side chambers branched off at irregular intervals, some natural, others blasted from living rock. "It's perfect," Clara said, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Defensible, hidden, with multiple escape routes. We could hold off an army from here. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." They established their camp in a large chamber about 100 yards from the main entrance. Running Bear had chosen well. The space was dry, with good air circulation and a natural chimney that would disperse smoke from a small fire. Previous occupants had left behind tools, mining equipment, and even some furniture carved from the chamber's stone walls. "Home," Clara said, but she didn't sound happy about it. Running Bear departed as silently as he'd arrived, leaving them alone with their supplies and their complicated emotions. Jacob arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the chamber, a practical decision that felt heavy with symbolic weight. "Afraid I might attack you in your sleep?" Clara asked, noticing the distance he'd put between them. "Afraid I might not be able to control myself if you're too close." The honesty surprised them both. Clara stared at him across the flickering lamplight, her expression unreadable. "Jacob, about what I said earlier." "Don't." He held up a hand to stop her. "Don't take it back. Don't apologize. Don't try to make it smaller than it is. We both said things that needed saying. Now we deal with the consequences. And what are the consequences?" Jacob looked around their stone prison, at the supplies that would sustain them through months of hiding, at the woman who'd turned his ordered life upside down in less than a week. "The consequences are that we learn to live with ourselves and each other. We learn what we're really made of when everything else is stripped away. And we find out if what we think we feel can survive being tested in the hardest ways possible." Clara nodded slowly, as if accepting a challenge. "Then I suppose we'd better get started." They spent the remaining hours before dawn, organizing their supplies and exploring the immediate tunnel system. Clara proved to have an excellent sense of direction underground, mapping their surroundings with the same precision she'd shown with weapons and survival skills. When exhaustion finally forced them to rest, they lay in their separate bedrolls, listening to the mountain's subtle sounds, water dripping somewhere in the depths, wind moving through hidden passages, the settling of ancient stone. It was a different kind of silence than the mountain's surface offered, older and more complete. "Jacob." Clara's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah? Whatever happens between us, whatever we become or don't become, thank you. For choosing me? For not turning me away when any reasonable man would have. Any reasonable man never had a sister like you." Her quiet laughter echoed off the stone walls. "No, I suppose they didn't. Sleep came eventually. But Jacob's dreams were filled with federal marshals and wanted posters, with photographs of dead innocents and wooden crosses that cast judgment across empty rooms. In his dreams, he heard Clara's voice whispering promises and confessions. But when he tried to reach for her, she dissolved like smoke. When he woke, pale light was filtering through the mine entrance, and the distant sound of horses' hooves echoed across the mountain. Coleman and his men had arrived, too late to catch their quarry, but early enough to discover the abandoned cabin and begin the hunt that would define the rest of the winter. Clara was already awake, sitting with her back against the stone wall, cleaning her weapons with methodical care. She looked up when Jacob stirred, and for a moment her guard dropped enough for him to see the fear she was trying to hide. "It's starting," she said simply. Outside, men called to each other in the thin mountain air, their voices carrying the authority of federal badges and the hunger of bounty hunters. But inside the mountain's heart, two fugitives prepared for a siege that would test every assumption they'd made about love, family, and the lengths they were willing to go to protect both. The photograph lay forgotten in the abandoned cabin. 4 happy faces smiling at emptiness, witnesses to an innocence that could never be reclaimed. But in its place, something new was being born, something harder, more complicated, and infinitely more dangerous. Whether it would prove to be salvation or damnation remained to be seen. But as the search party spread out across Jacob's former territory, the siblings who'd chosen each other over everything else settled in to wait out the storm. Winter was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would determine whether the bonds they'd forged were strong enough to survive the darkness ahead. 3 weeks in the mine's depths changed them both in ways Jacob hadn't anticipated. The forced intimacy of shared space, shared meals, shared silence in the lamplit darkness created a tension that grew stronger each day. Clara's hidden derringer, a nickel-plated weapon she kept tucked inside her, boot became a symbol of the secrets they still kept from each other despite their confessions. Jacob discovered the small pistol by accident when Clara's boot came loose during their morning exploration of the deeper tunnels. The weapon tumbled onto the stone floor with a metallic ring that echoed through the chamber like an accusation. "Insurance," Clara said, retrieving the derringer before Jacob could examine it closely. "A woman alone learns to keep final options available. You're not alone anymore, aren't I?" Clara's smile held no warmth. "Look around us, Jacob. Look at what we've become. 2 people hiding in a hole in the ground, afraid to show our faces in daylight. Is this togetherness, or is this just a more elaborate form of solitude?" The words stung because they carried truth. 3 weeks of living like cave dwellers had worn on both their nerves. They spoke less each day, moved around each other with careful politeness that felt more distant than hatred. The breaking point came during the first real blizzard of winter. Snow fell for 3 days straight, sealing them completely inside the mountain, while wind howled through the upper passages like the voices of the damned. Clara paced the chamber like a caged animal, her restless energy filling the space with dangerous electricity. Jacob tried to give her room, but in their stone prison, there was nowhere to go. On the 3rd night, she snapped, "I can't do this anymore." Clara's voice cracked with strain as she threw down the book she'd been pretending to read. "I can't pretend this is normal, that hiding underground like animals is some romantic adventure we're sharing." Jacob looked up from the map he'd been studying, noting the wild light in her eyes, the way her hands trembled with barely controlled emotion. "What do you want me to say, Clara? That this is easy? That I planned for us to spend the winter living like moles? I want you to say something real." She stood, abruptly, knocking over the oil lamp they'd been sharing. Jacob caught it before it could shatter, the flame dancing wildly between them. "I want you to admit that this was a mistake, that we should have run instead of hiding, that we're slowly going insane down here." "And go where?" Jacob's patience finally frayed. "How far do you think we'd get in this storm? How long before we froze to death or got lost in the wilderness?" "At least we'd die free." Clara's eyes blazed in the lamplight. "At least we'd die under open sky instead of buried alive in this stone tomb." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Jacob set the lamp down carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You think I trapped you here? You think this was my plan all along? I think you're afraid." Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more venom than shouting. "I think you brought me here not to protect me, but to control me, to keep me where you can watch me, possess me, without having to face the world's judgment." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. He'd spent 3 weeks watching Clara withdraw from him, seeing her natural wildness slowly being crushed by stone walls and artificial lamplight. He'd told himself it was temporary, that spring would restore her spirit. But perhaps she was right. Perhaps he had been selfish, keeping her caged like a beautiful, dangerous bird. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm afraid, but not of what you think." Clara's anger faltered slightly. "What are you afraid of, then?" "I'm afraid of losing you." Jacob's voice was raw with honesty. "I'm afraid that if I let you run, if I give you the freedom you need, you'll disappear again, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if you're alive or dead." The confession seemed to drain the fight out of Clara. She sank back onto her bedroll, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "Jacob, no, let me finish." He moved closer, kneeling beside her in the flickering light. "I'm afraid that what I feel for you is exactly what you said, desperation disguised as love. I'm afraid that I'm using our situation to justify things that have no justification." Clara looked up at him, tears reflecting the lamplight like tiny stars. "And I'm afraid that what I feel for you is real, that it's the only pure thing left in my life, and that makes it too dangerous to keep." The honesty hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the mountain, but inside their chamber, a different kind of storm was reaching its peak. "Come here," Jacob said softly. Clara shook her head. "We can't, not here, not like this. It would be wrong for all the wrong reasons. Everything we've done has been wrong for the right reasons." Jacob reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the path of tears down her cheek. "Maybe that's what love looks like for people like us." When she kissed him this time, it wasn't desperate or confused or driven by fear. It was deliberate, conscious, a choice made with full understanding of its consequences. Her lips tasted like regret and hope, like the last good thing in a world gone mad. They made love on rough blankets in the lamplight, their shadows dancing across ancient stone walls like cave paintings come to life. It was tender and fierce, gentle and desperate, everything that shouldn't be and everything that had to be. When it was over, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to each other breathe. "Now we're truly damned," Clara whispered against his chest. "I know. Do you regret it?" Jacob tightened his arms around her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his ribs. "I regret a lot of things. The fire that separated us, the years we spent apart, the violence that brought us together. But this, no, never this." Clara was quiet for so long that he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then very softly, "I used to dream about you, you know. Even when things were at their worst, I'd dream about finding you again. About being safe again. What did you dream? That you'd forgive me. That you'd look at me and not see all the terrible things I'd done to survive. That maybe, somehow, we could go back to being the people we were before everything went wrong." Jacob stroked her hair, dark silk against his fingers. "We can't go back, Clara. Those people are gone. I know. But maybe we can build something new. Something better. Something that honors what we had, while accepting what we've become." The words carried a weight of promise that neither dared examine too closely. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the mountain's heart, two damaged souls had found something worth protecting. When morning came, or what passed for morning in their timeless underground world, they moved around each other with new awareness. The careful distance was gone, replaced by a different kind of tension. They touched more, spoke more, shared space with the natural intimacy of people who'd crossed every boundary that mattered. Clara found her laughter again, the bright sound echoing through stone passages like music. Jacob discovered he could make her smile with stories from their childhood, memories she'd thought were lost to trauma and time. They established new routines, exploring the deeper cave systems together, planning improvements to their shelter, talking through the long winter nights about everything except what they'd do when spring came. The derringer remained in Clara's boot, but its significance had changed. No longer insurance against an uncertain future, it became simply another tool in their shared arsenal of survival. Trust, once broken and slowly rebuilt, was finally beginning to heal, but even as they found peace in their stone sanctuary, the world above continued its hunt. Coleman's men had established a semi-permanent camp in the valley, waiting for spring to flush out their quarry. The Garrett brothers, frustrated by their failure to claim the bounty, had begun expanding their search to other territories. And somewhere in the complex network of law enforcement and criminal enterprise that governed the frontier, new players were learning about the siblings who'd made themselves famous by choosing each other over everything else. Winter held them safe for now, but spring would bring reckonings they couldn't imagine. For the present, though, they had each other. And love that had been tested in fire and found strong enough to survive whatever judgment the world might render. The mountain kept its secrets, as mountains always had. And in its deepest heart, two souls who'd found each other against impossible odds, prepared to face whatever darkness might yet come. Secure in the knowledge that they would face it together, the derringer glinted in the lamplight, beautiful and deadly, like the woman who carried it and the love that had brought them to this place, beyond law and morality and ordinary human understanding. Some things were worth damnation, and some forms of love were strong enough to transform hell itself into home. The blood-stained map appeared in Clara's possessions like an accusation, discovered when Jacob was looking for medical supplies to treat a cut he'd sustained, exploring the deeper passages. The leather portfolio lay hidden beneath her spare clothes, wrapped in oiled cloth that couldn't quite mask the metallic smell of old violence. Jacob unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling as he recognized the careful markings that dotted the territory between Kansas and Colorado. Each red X marked a location, each location marked a death. 12 crosses, just as Clara had claimed. But seeing them laid out across hundreds of miles of wilderness made her confessions real in a way that words never could. You weren't supposed to find that. Clara's voice came from behind him, perfectly calm, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Jacob turned to find her standing in the chamber entrance, her silhouette framed by lamplight from the tunnel beyond. 12 men, Jacob said, his voice rough with something between awe and horror. 12 men across 3 territories. 13, actually. Clara moved into the chamber, her footsteps silent on the stone floor. The map doesn't include the one I killed last week, or the 2 from our cabin. The blood gets harder to wash out after a while. Jacob studied her face in the flickering light, searching for some sign of remorse, regret, anything that resembled the sister he'd thought he knew. But Clara's expression remained steady, professional, as if they were discussing the weather instead of a trail of corpses that stretched across half the frontier. Tell me about them. Which ones? All of them. I need to know who you've become, Clara. I need to know what I'm protecting. Clara settled onto her bedroll, arranging herself with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to be ready for violence at any moment. The first was in Lawrence, Kansas. Town drunk, who thought a young girl traveling alone was fair game for whatever he wanted to take. I put a kitchen knife through his ribs while he was trying to tear my dress off. Jacob waited, knowing there was more. The second was his brother, who came looking for revenge. Fair fight that time. He drew first, but I was faster. Word got around after that. People started talking about the girl who could handle herself in a scrape. That's when you started running. That's when I realized running wasn't enough. Clara's eyes held depths Jacob hadn't seen before, darkness that spoke of choices no 19-year-old should have faced. Men like that don't give up, Jacob. They hunt in packs and they pass information along. Kill one and 2 more hear about it. Let one live and he brings friends. The logic was sound, practical, the reasoning of someone who'd learned survival from the wrong teachers. But it chilled Jacob to hear it spoken so matter-of-factly by someone who'd once caught fireflies in mason jars and cried over injured birds. So you kept killing. I kept surviving. Clara leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge he'd heard before, usually right before violence erupted. The third was a bounty hunter in Dodge City, professional killer who'd been hired to bring me back to Lawrence for trial. The fourth was his partner. The fifth was a deputy marshal who got too interested in my business. Jacob found himself studying the map again, tracing the route Clara had taken across hostile territory. Each X represented not just a death, but a decision, a moment when his sister had chosen to kill rather than be killed, to become something harder and more dangerous rather than become a victim. The 6th through 9th were in Taos, Clara continued, her voice growing distant. Card players who thought they could cheat a woman out of her last stake, then claim other debts when the money was gone. I put them all down in less than 30 seconds. Running Bear mentioned 6 men in Taos. Running Bear doesn't know everything. Clara's smile held no warmth. The sheriff and his deputy tried to arrest me for disturbing the peace. They're buried in the same unmarked grave as the card players. 8 men dead in a single night. Jacob tried to imagine his sister, barely 20 years old, facing down 8 armed men and walking away without a scratch. The image should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a strange pride mixed with his horror. What about the rest? The 10th was a ranch foreman in Colorado Springs who thought he could buy my company for the night. The 11th was his boss, who had similar ideas and better connections. The 12th was a federal marshal who'd been tracking me for 6 months. Clara paused, her hands moving unconsciously toward her hidden derringer. That's when I realized they'd never stop coming. That's when I decided to find you. Jacob folded the map carefully, noting how the trail of violence led inexorably toward his mountain sanctuary. You came here because you were tired of running. I came here because I was tired of being alone with what I'd become. Clara's voice softened slightly. And because I hoped that maybe with you I could remember who I used to be. And have you? Remembered? Clara looked around their stone chamber, at the rough bedrolls where they'd made love, at the supplies that would sustain them through winter, at the brother who'd chosen to damn himself rather than abandon her again. I've remembered some things. The sound of your laugh. The way you used to read to me when I was sick. How safe I felt when you were around. She paused, her dark eyes meeting his. But I can't unmake what I've become, Jacob. Those 13 men will always be dead. That trail of blood will always lead back to me. Jacob set the map aside and moved to sit beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, to smell the soap she used to wash her hair in their underground basin. I don't want you to unmake anything, he said quietly. Those men tried to hurt you, tried to use you, tried to destroy you. You survived. You fought back. You became strong enough to make them pay for what they tried to take. Most people would call that murder. Most people never had to choose between becoming a killer and becoming a victim. Jacob reached for her hand, noting the calluses on her trigger finger, the steady way she held herself ready for violence. I'm not most people, Clara. I'm your brother, and I'm proud of you for becoming someone who can't be broken. The words seemed to crack something inside Clara's carefully maintained composure. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she made no sound, as if she'd forgotten how to cry properly after years of forcing herself to be hard as stone. Jacob, no, listen to me. Jacob pulled her closer, feeling her resistance dissolve as she allowed herself to be held. You think you became something terrible to survive. I think you became something magnificent. Strong enough to walk alone through hell, skilled enough to make your enemies pay, smart enough to find your way back to family when you needed it most. Clara buried her face against his shoulder, her voice muffled by tears and wool fabric. I was so afraid you'd see the map and decide I was too dangerous to love. Too damaged to save. Too dangerous? Jacob laughed, the sound echoing off stone walls. Clara, you're the most dangerous woman I've ever met. You're also the most beautiful, the smartest, the strongest, and the only person in this world I'd trust with my life. Why would any of that make me love you less? The confession seemed to surprise them both with its honesty. They'd been dancing around the word love for weeks, using it in context of family, of history, of anything except what was growing between them in the darkness of their underground sanctuary. Do you love me, Jacob? Really love me? Not just as a sister? The question hung between them like a challenge, demanding honesty that would change everything or destroy what little they'd built. Yes, the word came out rough as granite, certain as sunrise. God help me, yes. I love you as a brother should, and as a brother shouldn't, and as a man loves a woman he'd die to protect. I love every part of you, the innocent girl you were, the dangerous woman you became, and whatever you're becoming now. Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and something deeper. Even knowing what I've done, what I'm capable of, especially knowing what you've done. Jacob wiped tears from her cheeks with gentle fingers. You think I want some helpless flower who'd wilt at the first sign of trouble? I want a woman who can stand beside me when hell comes calling. I want someone who's already been through fire and came out stronger on the other side. When she kissed him this time, it tasted like salt and gratitude and promises neither of them fully understood. They made love again with desperate tenderness, as if they could somehow heal each other's wounds through the simple act of connection. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Clara spoke against his chest in words so quiet they might have been prayers. The Garrett brothers killed our parents. Jacob, not raiders, not random violence. The Garretts wanted our land for their cattle operation, and Papa wouldn't sell. So they burned us out and made it look like an accident. Jacob's body went rigid with shock and rage. How do you know this? Because Thomas Garrett told me himself. 3 years ago, when I was working in a saloon in Colorado Springs. He was drunk, bragging about his early days building the family business. Mentioned a stubborn farmer in Kansas who wouldn't listen to reason. He told you he killed our parents. He told me he'd killed lots of people who got in his way. Papa was just one name on a long list. Clara's voice hardened with fury that had been building for 3 years. That's when I started planning to come find you, because I realized we had more than just survival to worry about. We have justice to claim. The revelation recontextualized everything. Clara's arrival, her skills, even the bounty hunters who'd driven them underground. She hadn't just been running from her past. She'd been maneuvering toward revenge. You're planning to kill them. I'm planning to make them pay for what they took from us. Clara's hand moved to touch the outline of her derringer through the fabric of her clothes. The question is whether you'll help me or try to stop me. Jacob stared up at the stone ceiling of their chamber, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. The Garrett brothers had destroyed his family, stolen his childhood, forced him into 8 years of exile. They'd turned Clara into a killer and him into a hermit. They'd taken everything that mattered and left only violence and guilt in its place. I'll help you, he said finally. But we do it right. We plan carefully, we choose our moment, and we make sure we survive to see justice done. Clara's smile was sharp as her hidden blade, beautiful as deadly wildflowers. I was hoping you'd say that. Outside their sanctuary, winter continued to hold the mountain in its grip, but inside the stone chamber, 2 damaged souls prepared for a different kind of spring, one that would bring not just freedom from their underground prison, but reckoning for those who'd made them what they'd become. The blood-stained map lay forgotten between them, its crimson markings already planning new additions. Justice was coming to the Colorado territory, carried on the wind by a brother and sister who'd learned that sometimes love meant being willing to damn yourself for family. The Garrett brothers had no idea what they'd created when they destroyed the Thorne family. But spring would teach them, one bullet at a time. The wanted poster bearing Clara's face arrived with the spring melt, delivered by Running Bear, along with news that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. But it was the second piece of paper, a birth certificate dated 7 months in the future, that shattered Jacob's understanding of their predicament. Entirely, you're pregnant. Clara stood at the mine entrance, morning sunlight streaming across her face for the first time in 4 months. She'd grown pale during their underground winter, but now Jacob could see other changes. The subtle fullness in her face, the way her clothes fit differently, the instinctive way her hand rested on her still flat stomach. 2 months along, maybe 3. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than news that would reshape both their lives. I wasn't certain until recently. Jacob felt the world tilt beneath his feet. A child, their child, conceived in darkness and growing toward a future neither of them had planned for. When were you going to tell me? When I figured out what it meant. For us, For our plans, for everything we thought we were going to do. Clara turned away from the sunlight, back toward the shadows of their sanctuary. A pregnant woman can't fight the way I've been fighting, Jacob. She can't run, can't hide, can't kill her way out of trouble. The implications crashed over Jacob like an avalanche. Everything they'd planned, the revenge against the Garrett brothers, the spring offensive that would settle old debts, became impossible with Clara carrying their child. There's more. Running Bear's gravelly voice interrupted Jacob's spinning thoughts. The old trader held up a second wanted poster, this one newer, the ink still sharp and black. Federal marshals issued this one yesterday. The bounty on Clara's head has doubled. Jacob took the poster with numb fingers, reading words that made his blood run cold. Wanted for murder of federal officers, resistance to lawful arrest, and... He stopped, the words sticking in his throat. And corruption of family morals, Clara finished for him. They know about us, Jacob, about what we are to each other. The world had finally named their sin, given it official weight and federal consequence. Jacob stared at the poster, at his sister's face rendered in careful detail, at words that transformed their love into a crime worth $1,000 to whoever delivered her to justice. How do they know? Coleman! Running Bear spat into the dirt, his expression disgusted. He's been talking, spreading stories about what he found at your cabin. Claims he saw evidence of unnatural relations between siblings. Clara laughed, but the sound held no humor. Unnatural relations. Is that what they're calling it? It doesn't matter what they call it, Jacob said, anger building in his chest. It doesn't change what we are or what we mean to each other, doesn't it? Clara moved toward him, her hand unconsciously touching her belly. Look at us, Jacob, really look. I'm carrying your child, and half the law enforcement in 3 territories wants to hang us both for it. How do we raise a baby when we're the most wanted fugitives in the Colorado Territory? The question hung between them like an accusation. Jacob had spent months planning their revenge, preparing for a war against the men who destroyed their family. But warfare was no place for pregnant women or unborn children. We run, he said finally. California, Oregon, somewhere they don't know our faces. Run where? Clara's voice rose with frustration. There's nowhere left to run, Jacob. That poster will be in every town from here to the Pacific Ocean within a month. Telegraph lines carry information faster than horses these days. Running Bear cleared his throat, drawing their attention. There may be another option, dangerous but possible. Both siblings turned to look at the old trader, desperate for alternatives to the impossible choices they faced. Mexico, Running Bear said simply. Across the Rio Grande, where American law doesn't reach. I know people who can help you disappear completely. New names, new lives, new start for your family. Mexico. Jacob tested the word, trying to imagine himself as a Mexican farmer or shopkeeper, speaking Spanish to children who would never know their real heritage. That's not running away. That's disappearing forever. Forever might be what it takes. Clara's hand moved protectively over her stomach. Our child deserves a chance to grow up without looking over their shoulder for bounty hunters. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the valley below. All 3 moved to positions where they could observe the approaches to their hidden sanctuary. Coleman's men, Running Bear reported, his eyes sharp despite his age. But they're not shooting at targets. They're shooting at each other. Through the tree line, Jacob could make out figures moving with military precision, surrounding what appeared to be Coleman's makeshift camp. The sheriff and his remaining deputies were caught in a deadly crossfire, fighting for their lives against attackers who moved like professional soldiers. Who are they? Clara asked, raising Jacob's field glasses to study the battle. Garrett brothers, Jacob realized with growing dread. They're eliminating the competition. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Coleman and his federal posse were dead, their bodies scattered around the remains of their camp. The Garrett brothers and their men moved through the aftermath with cold efficiency, claiming weapons and supplies before disappearing back into the forest. They're not interested in the federal bounty, Clara said, lowering the glasses. They want us for their own reasons, Running Bear nodded grimly. Thomas Garrett has been asking questions about you both, specifically about your relationship. He's not interested in justice. He wants revenge for the humiliation of losing his prey to a woman. Jacob felt pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture more dangerous than simple bounty hunting. He knows we killed his reputation along with Coleman's men. Every day we stay free makes him look weak. More than that, Clara added, her voice thoughtful. He knows about the baby. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. How could he know? Because I told him. Clara's confession came out flat and emotionless. 3 weeks ago, when I went to scout their positions, I let him see me, let him get close enough to talk. Jacob stared at his sister in shock. You did what? I needed to know what we were facing, so I played the helpless pregnant woman, let him think he'd caught me alone and vulnerable. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. Told him all about the baby growing inside me, about how desperate I was to protect it. Clara, that was insane. No, it was strategic. Her eyes hardened with purpose Jacob hadn't seen since their first night together. Because now Thomas Garrett thinks he holds all the cards. He thinks he can use our child against us, force us to surrender by threatening the one thing we can't afford to lose. Running Bear was studying Clara with something approaching awe. You set a trap. I set a trap, Clara confirmed. And now all we have to do is spring it. Jacob felt the world shifting again, revealing depths to Clara's planning that he'd never suspected. What kind of trap? The kind that ends with the Garrett brothers dead and us free to disappear into Mexico with our child. Clara's hand moved to her hidden derringer, checking its position by instinct. But it's going to require you to trust me completely, even when what I'm doing looks like betrayal. The weight of her words settled over Jacob like a burial shroud. Clara had been planning this from the moment she discovered her pregnancy, using their unborn child not as a weakness, but as the ultimate weapon against their enemies. Tell me, he said simply. Clara looked toward the valley, where Coleman's body lay cooling in the mountain air, where the Garrett brothers had just announced their intentions with fire and blood. When she spoke, her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd already seen how the story would end. Tomorrow night, I'm going to surrender myself to Thomas Garrett. I'm going to tell him that you're dead, killed in a mining accident while trying to escape through the deep tunnels. I'm going to beg him to spare our child in exchange for information about where you hid your gold. Jacob's blood turned to ice water. Clara, and while he's distracted by thoughts of treasure and revenge, while he has me tied up in his camp thinking he's won everything, you're going to kill every man he's brought to this mountain. Clara's smile was beautiful and terrible, like a wildflower growing from a grave. By the time he realizes I've played him, it will be too late. For him, for his brothers, for anyone stupid enough to stand between us and freedom. The plan was brilliant, insane, and absolutely certain to get one or both of them killed. It was also the only chance they had to eliminate the threat permanently and protect their unborn child from a lifetime of running. And if something goes wrong, if he doesn't believe your story or decides to kill you anyway, Clara's hand moved to touch her stomach, where their child grew in darkness, like hope taking root in impossible soil. Then you make sure our baby never knows what cowards look like. You make sure the Garrett name dies with them, and you take our child to Mexico, where they can grow up free. Jacob stared at the woman he loved, seeing in her face the innocent sister she'd been, the dangerous killer she'd become, and the fierce mother she was becoming. She was willing to risk everything, her life, their love, their future, to give their child what neither of them had ever known, the chance to grow up safe. I won't let you do this alone. You won't be alone. Clara moved into his arms, her body fitting against his like two pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. You'll be exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you do best. And when it's over, when the Garretts are dead and buried, we'll disappear into Mexico and never look back. As the sun set over the Colorado Rockies, painting the sky the color of blood and gold, two lovers prepared for the most dangerous gamble of their lives. Their child was growing in Clara's womb, innocent and unaware of the violence being planned for its protection. Tomorrow would bring reckoning for the men who destroyed one family and tried to destroy another. But tonight belonged to Jacob and Clara Thorne, to love that had survived every test and judgment, to promises made in darkness that would either save them all or damn them completely. The wanted posters lay forgotten in the dirt, their black ink fading in the mountain air. But the child they described as evidence of corruption would soon be the only witness to justice finally being served. One bullet at a time, their father's silver pocket watch ticked away the final hours before Clara's surrender, its steady rhythm marking time that felt both endless and desperately short. Jacob held the timepiece in his palm, watching the hands move toward destiny with mechanical indifference to the lives that hung in the balance. 6 hours, Clara said, checking her weapons one final time. Her movements were precise, professional, betraying none of the fear Jacob knew she must be feeling. Sunrise comes at 5:15. I'll be in position by then. They'd spent the night going over every detail of their plan, accounting for variables and contingencies until Jacob's head swam with possibilities. Clara would approach the Garrett camp from the east, playing the part of a desperate woman seeking mercy. Jacob would take position on the ridge overlooking their temporary stronghold. With clear sight lines to every approach and escape route, 17 men, Jacob said, reviewing Running Bear's intelligence reports one more time. Thomas, William, and Marcus Garrett, plus 14 hired guns. All experienced killers, all overconfident because they think they're hunting a pregnant woman and a dead man. Clara's smile held no warmth. Overconfidence has killed more men than bullets ever did. She was right, but 17-to-1 odds would challenge even Clara's legendary skills. Jacob had watched her practice during their months underground, seen her draw and fire with speed that defied belief. But pregnancy was already affecting her balance, her stamina, her ability to move with the fluid grace that had kept her alive through 13 previous encounters. Clara, Jacob caught her hand as she reached for her ammunition pouch. There's still time to change our minds. We could run tonight, be in Mexico before they know we're gone, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Clara shook her head firmly. Our child deserves better than that, Jacob. They deserve parents who faced their demons and won. The conviction in her voice steadied something inside Jacob that had been wavering since sunrise. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about legacy, about what kind of world they would leave for the innocent life growing in Clara's womb. Running Bear will have the horses waiting at Devil's Canyon, Jacob said, reviewing their escape plan. If everything goes according to schedule, we'll be across the Rio Grande within a week. And if it doesn't go according to schedule? Jacob met her eyes steadily. Then our child will grow up hearing stories about parents who died fighting instead of running. Clara nodded approvingly. I can live with that legacy. They made love one final time as dawn approached, with desperate tenderness and unspoken prayers. It might be the last time they held each other, the last time they could pretend the world consisted of nothing but their stone chamber and the love they'd forged in darkness. Afterward, as they prepared for what could be their final battle, Clara performed a ritual Jacob hadn't expected. She took the wooden cross, their father's last gift, and pressed it into Jacob's hands. For luck, she said simply. Papa always said faith was about what you carried in your heart. Maybe it's time to find out what we're really carrying. Jacob tucked the cross into his coat pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against his chest. Samuel Thorne had carved it during their last winter together, back when faith seemed simpler and family meant safety rather than sin. Now it would witness whatever justice they were about to deliver. Time to go, Clara said, checking the eastern horizon where the first pale light was beginning to show. Jacob gathered his weapons, his father's Winchester, a Colt revolver, and the knife that had saved his life more times than he could count. Clara carried her usual arsenal, the Derringer in her boot, a Smith & Wesson at her hip, and a small but deadly blade concealed in her sleeve. They climbed toward the surface together, emerging from their underground sanctuary into the crisp mountain air. 4 months of hiding had ended. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether they would see another winter, another spring, another chance to hold their child, Jacob. Clara stopped at the point where their paths would diverge, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, but if it does... She stepped closer, her hand moving to rest on her still flat belly. Promise me you'll get word to the child somehow. Promise me they'll know we loved each other, that we died for something that mattered. The request hit Jacob like a physical blow. The thought of raising their child alone, of explaining how love could be both salvation and damnation, seemed impossible to bear. I promise, he said, pulling her into his arms one final time. But you're going to be there to tell them yourself. We both are. Clara's kiss tasted like goodbye and forever, like every beautiful thing they'd shared and every terrible thing they'd survived. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you, Jacob Thorne. Brother, lover, partner, whatever the hell we are, I love you more than life itself. And I love you, Clara Thorne. More than God, more than salvation, more than my own soul. They separated then, moving toward their respective positions with the fluid precision of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. Jacob climbed toward the ridge, while Clara descended toward the valley, both carrying pieces of each other's heart into battle. The Garrett camp sprawled across a natural clearing 2 miles from the old mine entrance. Jacob studied it through his field glasses, noting the defensive positions, the guard rotations, the way the brothers had positioned themselves at the heart of their operation. Professional setup, but not perfect. There were gaps, blind spots, moments when pride would overcome caution. Thomas Garrett stood beside a large tent at the center of camp, his weathered face showing the cruel intelligence that had built the family empire. William paced nearby, younger and more volatile, his hand never far from his gun. Marcus, the eldest, sat cleaning a rifle with mechanical precision. Every movement, speaking of decades, spent dealing death. 14 hired guns moved through the camp with lazy confidence. Men who'd killed for money so long they'd forgotten to fear death. But Jacob had learned something during his years in the mountains that money couldn't teach. When you fought for something you loved more than life itself, you became capable of impossible things. Clara appeared at the tree line exactly at sunrise, moving with the careful steps of a woman carrying precious cargo. Her performance was flawless. She stumbled occasionally, held her belly protectively, called out in a voice cracked with exhaustion and desperation, Thomas Garrett. I need to talk. The entire camp went silent, weapons appearing in hands with practiced speed. Thomas stepped forward, his face showing surprised satisfaction at seeing his quarry deliver herself. Well, well. Clara Thorne, as I live and breathe. Come to surrender at last. Come to bargain. Clara stopped 30 yards from the nearest gunman, keeping herself in the open where everyone could see her. My brother's dead. Mining accident 3 days ago. I'm alone, pregnant, and tired of running. Jacob watched Thomas's expression change, calculating advantage like a man counting money. This was what Clara had predicted. The moment when greed and pride would override caution. Dead, you say. How convenient. And what makes you think I'm in a bargaining mood? Clara's hand moved to her belly, the gesture visible even from Jacob's elevated position. Because I'm carrying the last of the Thorne bloodline. Because I know where Jacob hid 2 years' worth of gold mining proceeds. And because you're not the kind of man who wastes valuable assets. The hook was set. Jacob could see it in Thomas's posture, in the way he moved closer despite his men's obvious nervousness. Greed was making him stupid, just as Clara had predicted. What do you want in return for this information? Safe passage to Mexico for me and the child. A chance to disappear and never trouble you again. Thomas laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the mountain air. You're in no position to make demands, girl. But I'm feeling generous this morning. Tell me where the gold is, and I'll make sure your death is quick. You can say the same for the bastard you're carrying. The threat sent rage coursing through Jacob's veins, but he forced himself to remain still. This was Clara's show, her trap to spring. His moment would come. The gold's hidden in the mine. Clara said, her voice carrying just the right note of defeated resignation. Fifth tunnel from the main entrance, behind a rockfall Jacob triggered before the accident. You'll need explosives to reach it. Jacob watched through his scope as Thomas consulted with his brothers, saw the greed light up their faces like Christmas morning. 2 years of gold mining proceeds would be worth thousands of dollars, enough to buy respectability, political influence, everything the Garretts had ever wanted. William, take 8 men and check out that mine, Thomas ordered. Marcus, you and the rest stay here and keep our guest comfortable. Perfect. Clara had just divided their forces, reduced the odds from 17 to 1 to something merely suicidal. 9 men remaining in camp, spread out across defensive positions that would become death traps once Jacob started shooting. Clara was led to a spot near the central fire, her hands bound but loosely, another sign of male overconfidence that would prove fatal. She sat quietly, playing the part of defeated woman while actually memorizing positions, calculating angles, preparing for the moment when submission would transform into violence. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the valley and lengthening shadows that would provide concealment for what was coming. Jacob checked his father's pocket watch, 7:30. William's group would reach the mine in another hour, giving them time to disappear into the tunnels before the shooting started. At 8:15, the first explosion echoed across the valley, William's men blasting through the rockfall Clara had described. The sound brought cheers from the remaining Garretts, celebration of wealth they would never live to spend. At 8:30, Jacob saw Clara's subtle signal, her hand moving to adjust her hair in a pattern they'd practiced dozens of times. She was ready. Jacob centered his crosshairs on Marcus Garrett's chest and whispered a prayer to whatever God watched over damned souls and dangerous love. Papa, if you're listening, help us protect what matters. The silver pocket watch ticked toward 8:31, marking the moment when love would finally demand its price from those who tried to destroy it. In the valley below, a pregnant woman prepared to become death itself, while on the ridge above, her brother lover took aim at the hearts of men who'd forgotten that some things were worth any price. The wooden cross pressed against Jacob's chest as he took his final breath and squeezed the trigger, sending justice screaming across the morning. Air at over 1,000 feet per second. The war for their family's honor had begun. The dynamite Jacob had stolen from running. Bear's cache exploded with the force of divine judgment, sending rock and flame shooting skyward from the Garrett camp's supply depot. The blast wave rolled across the valley like thunder, and in its aftermath, chaos bloomed deadly as wildflowers. Marcus Garrett's head snapped back as Jacob's first shot took him center mass, the eldest brother dead before his body hit the ground. The Winchester's report echoed off the canyon walls a split second later, announcing that the hunt had turned into a slaughter. Clara moved like liquid lightning, her bound hands finding the knife hidden in her sleeve, even as Thomas Garrett spun toward the sound of gunfire. The derringer appeared in her free hand with magic trick speed, its small barrel speaking death to the nearest gunman before he could draw his weapon. "It's a trap," Thomas shouted, but his voice was lost in the pandemonium as Jacob's second shot dropped another hired gun. "Kill the woman!" But Clara was no longer where she'd been a heartbeat before. Pregnancy might have slowed her slightly, but years of fighting for survival had taught her to use every advantage. Confusion, surprise, the natural tendency of men to underestimate a woman's capacity for violence. Jacob's third shot shattered a water barrel, sending a spray of liquid across the central fire and creating a cloud of steam that provided perfect concealment for Clara's deadly work. His fourth shot took out a gunman trying to flank her position, the bullet spinning the man like a child's top before dropping him in the dirt. Through his scope, Jacob watched Clara fight with a precision that took his breath away. She moved through the enemy positions like smoke, appearing just long enough to deliver death before vanishing into shadows and confusion. The derringer cracked repeatedly, each shot finding its mark with surgical accuracy. Thomas Garrett rallied his remaining men with barked commands. trying to organize a coherent defense against attackers whose positions they couldn't determine. "Find that sniper. Pin down the woman. $500 to whoever brings me her head." Jacob shifted positions along the ridge, using the terrain he'd studied for months to stay ahead of the searching rifle barrels below. A bullet whined past his ear too close, but his return shot silenced the man who'd fired it permanently. 7 men down. 6 remaining plus Thomas Garrett himself. The odds were improving, but the survivors were the smartest and most experienced fighters. The ones who'd lived through enough battles to recognize when a situation had turned hopeless. Clara's ammunition ran low. Jacob could tell by the way she moved. More cautiously now, saving each shot for maximum effect. She'd taken cover behind an overturned wagon, her breathing visible in small puffs of vapor in the cool morning air. Clara Thorne. Thomas's voice carried across the battle zone, thick with rage and wounded pride. "I know you can hear me. Surrender now and I'll make your death quick. Keep fighting, and I'll gut-shoot you and let you die slow, thinking about what I'm going to do to that bastard in your belly." Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger, but Thomas was too smart to expose himself. The man had learned caution through decades of violence, and even fury couldn't completely override his survival instincts. Clara's response came in the form of her Derringer's final shot, taking down the gunman who'd been trying to work around to her flank. The small weapon clicked empty, and Jacob watched her smoothly transition to her backup revolver. Brave words from a man hiding behind other men's bodies. Clara's voice rang clear across the morning air. "Why don't you face me yourself, Thomas? Show everyone what a big man you are." The taunt worked. Thomas Garrett stepped into the open, his face twisted with rage, a heavy Colt .45 in his hand. "You want me, whore? Come and take me!" Jacob had a perfect shot. Thomas was standing in clear ground, backlit by the morning sun. But something made him hesitate, some instinct that this moment belonged to Clara alone. She rose from behind the wagon like a vengeful spirit, her revolver steady despite everything she'd been through. For a heartbeat, brother and sister faced the man who destroyed their family. The moment stretching taut as a bowstring. "This is for Samuel and Martha Thorne," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "This is for the children we used to be." Both guns fired simultaneously. Thomas's shot went wide, spoiled by haste and fury. Clara's bullet took him in the chest, staggering him but not dropping him immediately. "Impossible," Thomas gasped, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt. "Just a woman." Clara's second shot ended his words forever, the bullet finding his heart with surgical precision. Thomas Garrett fell backward into the dirt, his eyes reflecting nothing but sky and final judgment. The sudden silence was deafening. 6 hired guns lay dead or dying around the camp, their confidence destroyed along with their bodies. The Garrett brothers, terror of the Colorado Territory for 20 years, were finished. Their reign of violence ended by a pregnant woman and her brother's love. Jacob started down from the ridge, moving carefully but quickly. William Garrett and his men would have heard the explosions, the gunfire. They'd be returning from the mine soon, and the battle wasn't over yet. Clara met him halfway, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fierce satisfaction. "How many more?" 8 men with William. "Maybe 9 if someone stayed behind to guard the horses." She nodded, already thinking tactically despite the emotional weight of what they'd just accomplished. "We need to move. The camp's compromised, but we can use the terrain." The distant sound of galloping horses cut her off. William's group, returning at full speed toward the smoke and silence that had replaced their comfortable base. "The canyon," Jacob said, pointing toward the narrow pass where Running Bear waited with their escape route. "We can reach it before they get organized." But Clara was looking at something else, the supply depot they'd destroyed, where crates of ammunition were still cooking off in sporadic explosions. Her expression showed the calculating mind that had kept her alive through 13 previous encounters. "No," she said quietly. "We end this here. We end it now, so our child never has to worry about the Garrett name again." Jacob followed her gaze and understood. The returning riders would pass through a natural bottleneck where the trail entered the valley. With the high ground and good positions, two skilled marksmen could turn pursuit into massacre. "Clara, you're pregnant. You've already done enough." "I'm pregnant, not helpless." Her smile was sharp as her blade, beautiful as deadly nightshade. "Besides, this is our family we're protecting, our legacy we're building. I won't have our child grow up hearing stories about how Mama ran when the real fighting started." Before Jacob could argue further, she was moving toward the defensive positions the Garretts had prepared for their own protection. Irony had a bitter taste, but justice demanded its due, regardless of flavor. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, mixed with shouting voices and the ring of steel as weapons were readied for battle. William Garrett was coming home to find his world destroyed, his brothers dead. His dreams of empire turned to smoke and cooling corpses. Jacob took position behind a boulder that provided cover and clear sight lines down the trail. Clara settled into a sniper's nest 30 yards to his left, her revolver reloaded and her spare ammunition arranged within easy reach. "Just like old times," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of dark humor. "We've never done this before." "No, but we've been preparing for it our whole lives." Clara's expression grew serious as the hoofbeats drew closer. "Jacob, if something happens to me, if I don't make it out of this, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, promise me you'll tell our child about today, about how we stood together against the people who hurt our family. Promise me they'll know we chose each other over everything else, even when the world called it wrong." Jacob felt the wooden cross pressing against his chest. His father's faith transformed into something harder and more necessary than simple belief. "I promise, Clara, but you're going to tell them yourself." The first rider appeared at the trail mouth, William Garrett. His face twisted with rage and growing fear as he took in the destruction of his family's empire. 8 men followed him, all armed, all dangerous, all about to learn what happened when you threatened the wrong family's future. Jacob centered his crosshairs on William's chest and whispered a final prayer for the innocent life growing in Clara's womb. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether that child would grow up free or spend their life running from the shadows of their parents' choices. The Winchester spoke its deadly language once more, and William Garrett pitched backward from his saddle, his dreams of revenge ending before they could begin. The war for the Thorne family's honor was entering its final phase, and mercy was no longer an option for anyone. The makeshift wedding ring Jacob carved from mountain stone while Clara reloaded spoke of promises that transcended law and convention. He'd shaped it during their months underground, working the granite smooth with patient devotion, creating something that would mark their bond, regardless of what the world called them. William Garrett's death scream echoed off the canyon walls as Jacob's bullet found its mark. But the remaining 7 riders scattered with professional skill, taking cover behind boulders and fallen trees. These weren't panicked amateurs. They were experienced killers who'd survived other ambushes. 2 shooters, one of them called. "High ground, east and southeast. Flank them!" Clara's revolver cracked in response, the bullet sparking off rock inches from the shouting man's head. Her pregnancy was beginning to show in subtle ways. Her breathing came harder after exertion. Her balance wasn't quite what it had been, but her aim remained deadly accurate. Jacob worked the Winchester's lever action, brass casings glinting in the morning sun as they ejected from the rifle. Another shot, another Garrett hire falling from his horse to lie motionless in the dusty trail. 6 men remaining, but they were adapting quickly, using terrain and tactics learned from fighting Apache and Mexican banditos. "Split up." The voice belonged to a grizzled man Jacob recognized from Running Bear's descriptions. Pike Henderson, former cavalry sergeant turned professional killer. "Morrison, take 2 men up the north ridge. Santos, circle south. We'll pin them in a crossfire." Clara caught Jacob's eye and nodded toward a depression in the rocks that would provide better cover. They moved together with the fluid coordination of people who'd learned to read each other's thoughts. Clara covering their retreat while Jacob provided overwatch. A bullet whined off the stone where Clara's head had been a moment before, chips of granite stinging her cheek. She returned fire instinctively, her shot taking Morrison center mass as he tried to flank their position. 5 left, Jacob called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. 5 too many, Clara replied, checking her ammunition. 4 rounds in the cylinder, 2 spare speed loaders. Enough to finish the job if they were careful. Pike Henderson's voice carried across the battlefield, thick with professional respect and growing frustration. Clara Thorne, I heard stories about you in Taos. They say you're faster than lightning and twice as deadly. Clara's laugh held no humor. They obviously didn't tell you I was pregnant. Come find out what that's done to my disposition. Jacob smiled grimly. Even facing impossible odds, Clara couldn't resist psychological warfare. Fear was a weapon like any other, and she wielded it with master's skill. The attack came from 2 directions simultaneously. Santos and another gunman charging up the southern approach, while Pike and his remaining partner advanced from the north. Classic pincer movement, executed with military precision. Jacob's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, dropping both northern attackers before they could reach effective range. But Santos made it to within 20 feet of Clara's position before her revolver found him, the heavy slug spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. That left Pike Henderson alone among the stones, the last of the Garrett organization's hired killers. Jacob could hear him moving, the subtle scrape of boot leather on granite as he worked closer to their position. Just you and me now, Pike, Clara called. Your employers are all dead. No one's paying you to die today. Some things ain't about money, girl. Pike's voice came from closer than Jacob expected. The man was good, moving with the stealth of someone who'd hunted human prey across hostile territory. Sometimes a man's got to see a job through to the end. Clara's eyes met Jacob's across their makeshift fortification. She was thinking the same thing he was. Pike Henderson wasn't giving up, and he was too experienced to be fooled by tricks or intimidation. This would end in blood, one way or another. The wooden cross pressed against Jacob's chest as he made his decision. Rolling from cover, he exposed himself deliberately, drawing Pike's fire while Clara moved to flank the veteran killer. Pike's shot took Jacob high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the Winchester flying from his hands. But the sacrifice worked. Clara had a clear shot at Pike's exposed position, and she didn't waste it. The former cavalry sergeant crumpled with Clara's bullet in his heart, his own weapon falling silent forever. The last echo of gunfire faded across the valley, leaving behind the kind of silence that spoke of finished business. Clara reached Jacob's side as he struggled to sit up, blood seeping through his shirt, but the wound not immediately life-threatening.
How bad?
She asked, her hands already working to assess the damage. I'll live. Jacob gritted his teeth against the pain. Is it over? Are they all dead? Clara looked across the battlefield, counting bodies with the professional thoroughness of someone who'd learned that carelessness killed. 17 men, all accounted for. The Garrett brothers and their entire organization. The finality of it settled over them both. No more running, no more looking over shoulders, no more fear that their child would inherit their enemies along with their love. The slate was clean, written in blood and justice. We did it, Jacob said, wonder creeping into his voice. We actually did it. Clara helped him to his feet, her own exhaustion showing now that the immediate danger had passed. We did it together, like everything else that matters. As they made their way toward Devil's Canyon, where Running Bear waited with their escape route, Clara pulled the stone ring from her pocket, Jacob's crude but heartfelt symbol of commitment that no church would sanctify and no law would recognize. When we reach Mexico, she said, slipping the ring onto her finger, we'll find a priest who's seen enough of life not to judge. Someone who understands that love takes different forms in hard places. Jacob nodded, his good arm around Clara's waist as they walked through the aftermath of their war. Behind them lay 17 corpses and the end of a vendetta that had shaped their entire adult lives. Ahead lay Mexico, freedom, and the chance to raise their child in peace. What will we tell them? Jacob asked. When our son or daughter is old enough to ask about today, about what we had to do? Clara considered the question as they climbed toward salvation, her free hand resting protectively on her belly. We'll tell them that love sometimes requires terrible choices, that family means protecting what matters most, no matter the cost, that their parents chose each other over everything else, even when the world called it wrong. She paused, looking back at the valley where the Garrett Empire had died. And we'll tell them that justice doesn't always wear a badge or carry legal authority. Sometimes it comes in the form of a brother and sister who refuse to let evil win. The stone ring caught the morning light as Clara adjusted it on her finger, a circle of granite that bound them more surely than any gold band blessed by conventional authority. They were married now in the only way that mattered, by choice, by blood, by shared violence, and by love that had survived every test the world could devise. Running Bear's horses waited in the canyon shadows, strong animals capable of carrying them across the Rio Grande to their new lives. But as they prepared to leave Colorado territory forever, both Jacob and Clara felt the weight of what they carried, not just their unborn child, but the knowledge that some bonds were stronger than law, deeper than morality, and more enduring than the judgments of people who'd never had to choose between survival and sanctity. The wooden cross had survived the battle, still pressed against Jacob's chest like his father's final blessing. Samuel Thorne had carved it for children he'd believed would grow up safe and innocent. But perhaps it would serve just as well for grandchildren who would learn that love sometimes required taking up arms against those who threatened family. Mexico beckoned with promises of anonymity and fresh starts, of children who could grow up free from the shadows of their parents' past. But the mountain would remember what happened here, and sometimes memory was its own form of justice. The Thorne family name would live on, carried by a child conceived in darkness and born into light, raised by parents who'd proven that some things were worth any price, even damnation itself. The child's cradle, carved from Colorado pine, sat beside their small window, in the adobe house they'd built outside. Guadalajara, its gentle curves catching the Mexican sunlight that filtered through white cotton curtains. Jacob had shaped it during Clara's final months of pregnancy, working the mountain wood with the same patient devotion he'd once used to craft their stone wedding ring. 6 months had passed since they'd crossed the Rio Grande with Running Bear's help. 6 months of learning to be people they'd never been before. Jacob's shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a scar that reminded him of the price they'd paid for freedom. Clara's pregnancy had progressed without complication, her body growing round with the promise of new life, even as her past grew distant as morning dreams. "She's beautiful," Clara whispered, cradling their daughter against her chest in the warm afternoon light. Little Martha, named for the grandmother she'd never know, had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes. 3 weeks old, and already showing signs of the fierce independence that ran in Thorne blood. Jacob settled beside them, in the rocking chair he'd built for moments like this, his arms encircling both the women who'd become his entire world. The wooden cross lay on the table nearby, worn smooth by handling and time, a reminder of the faith that had carried them through their darkest hours. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, noting the distant expression on Jacob's face, about how different this might have been. "If we'd made other choices, taken other paths." Jacob's finger traced their daughter's tiny hand, marveling at the perfection of something so small and innocent. "Sometimes I wonder if we deserved this happiness." Clara's smile held the wisdom of someone who'd walked through hell and found love on the other side. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. We fought for this, Jacob. We bled for it, killed for it, damned ourselves for it. That makes it ours by right of conquest." Through their window, they could see the small town where they'd made their new life. The locals knew them as Juan and Maria Hernandez, refugees from the violence that plagued the borderlands. Their Spanish was improving daily, helped by neighbors who asked few questions and offered much kindness to the young family that had appeared with gold enough to buy land and livestock. The wanted posters that bore their real names gathered dust in sheriff's offices hundreds of miles away. irrelevant now to people who'd legally ceased to exist. Sheriff Coleman was dead. The Garrett brothers were memory, and the federal marshals had long since moved on to fresher crimes and more accessible fugitives. "I'd got a letter from Running Bear," Jacob said, producing the weathered envelope from his shirt pocket. "Came through the usual channels." Clara looked up with interest. The Cherokee trader had arranged their new identities, their escape route, and the complex network of contacts that allowed them to receive occasional news from their former lives. "What does he say?" "The mine's been officially declared abandoned. The Colorado territorial government has written off the whole area as worthless. Too remote, too dangerous, too much bad history." Jacob smiled at the irony. "Our old home is being left to the wolves and the weather. Good. Let it return to wilderness. Some places are better forgotten." Jacob unfolded the letter, reading Running Bear's careful script by the window light. "He also says there have been no more inquiries about us. No bounty hunters, no federal interest. As far as the law's concerned, Jacob and Clara Thorne died in those mountains. The information should have brought relief, but Clara's expression grew thoughtful instead. "And what about the truth? What happens to the real story of what we did, why we did it?" It was a question that had haunted them both during their months of exile. They'd eliminated a criminal organization, avenged their parents' murder, and protected innocent people from further violence. But history would remember them, if at all, as fugitives who disappeared into legend. "Maybe the truth doesn't matter," Jacob suggested. "Maybe what matters is that we know who we are and why we made the choices we did, and what we're going to teach her about those choices." Clara looked down at their sleeping daughter, her expression fierce with protective love. "When she's old enough to ask hard questions, what do we tell her about where she came from?" Jacob considered this, watching sunlight play across his daughter's peaceful face. Martha would grow up believing Juan Hernandez was her father, Maria her mother. She'd speak Spanish as her first language, pray to Catholic saints, learn Mexican history as her own heritage. But someday she might wonder about the American features she'd inherited, the English words her parents sometimes spoke when they thought she wasn't listening. "We tell her that love takes many forms," Jacob said finally. "That family means protecting what matters most, no matter what the world thinks about it. That her parents chose each other over everything else because some bonds are stronger than law or convention. And if she asks about the violence, about the men we killed, we tell her that justice doesn't always come from judges and juries. Sometimes it comes from people who refuse to let evil go unpunished." Jacob's hand moved to touch the scar on his shoulder, remembering the weight of his father's rifle, the sound of Clara's derringer, the sight of Thomas Garrett falling in the mountain dust. "We tell her that good people sometimes have to do terrible things to protect the innocent." Clara nodded slowly, accepting the weight of future conversations they'd need to navigate with care. Their daughter would grow up hearing stories, fragments of truth wrapped in metaphor and parable. Perhaps she'd understand, when she was older, why her parents spoke of love as something worth fighting for, dying for, sacrificing everything for. A knock at their door interrupted the peaceful moment, but Jacob's hand moved only casually toward the pistol he still kept within reach. Their new life was built on caution, but not paranoia. Mexico had welcomed them with the indifference of a country too large and too troubled to worry about American fugitives. The visitor was Father Miguel, the elderly priest who'd married them in a simple ceremony that asked no questions about previous names or family relationships. He'd seen too much of human nature during his decades in frontier parishes to judge love that fell outside conventional boundaries. "Buenos dias, Juan Maria," the old priest said, smiling at the domestic scene. "I came to check on the little one. How is she adjusting to the world?" "Growing stronger every day, Padre," Clara replied in Spanish that had lost most of its American accent. "She sleeps well, eats well, and already shows signs of her father's stubbornness." Father Miguel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Strong will is not a fault in this country. She'll need determination to make her way in the world." Jacob poured coffee for their guest, noting how the priest's eyes lingered on the wooden cross that lay among their few possessions. Father Miguel had seen it before, had recognized its craftsmanship as distinctly American Protestant work. But like everything else about the Hernandez family, it was simply accepted without question. "I wanted to talk to you about the baptism," Father Miguel continued. "The congregation would be honored to welcome Martha into the church. And perhaps it's time for you both to consider taking communion yourselves. You've been in Mexico long enough to call it home." The suggestion carried implications beyond simple religious observance. Taking communion would mark their complete integration into Mexican society, their final transformation from American fugitives into Mexican citizens. Their daughter would grow up fully accepted, never knowing she'd been born into exile. "We'd be honored, Padre," Jacob said, after glancing at Clara for confirmation. "Martha deserves every blessing we can give her." After Father Miguel left, they sat together in the fading afternoon light, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. The pine cradle creaked gently in the breeze from their open window, its familiar sound mixing with distant church bells and the laughter of children playing in dusty streets. "No regrets?" Clara asked, her voice soft with contentment. Jacob looked around their simple home, at the woman he loved and the child they'd created together, at the life they'd built from the ashes of everything they'd once been. Outside, Mexico stretched toward horizons that held promise instead of pursuit, tomorrow instead of yesterday. "No regrets," he said firmly. "We chose each other over everything else. We chose love over law, family over convention, hope over judgment. Look what it gave us." Clara's smile was radiant in the golden light, no longer the sharp expression of a dangerous woman, but the gentle warmth of a mother at peace. "Sometimes I think about that night in the mine, when we first admitted what we felt for each other. It seems like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago. We're different people now. Better people?" Jacob considered the question, thinking about the violence they'd left behind, the enemies who would never threaten anyone again, the child who slept safely because her parents had refused to let evil win. "Different people," he said finally. "People who learned that sometimes you have to go through hell to find heaven. People who discovered that love doesn't always look like what the world expects it to look like." Clara shifted their daughter to her other arm, the movement natural and practiced now. Martha stirred slightly, but didn't wake, secure in the knowledge that strong arms held her safe. "I used to think we were damned," Clara said quietly. "That what we felt for each other, what we did together, had put us beyond redemption." But looking at her, she gazed down at their daughter's peaceful face. "How can something so pure come from something the world calls wrong?" Jacob reached out to touch Martha's tiny hand, still amazed that something so perfect could exist in a world he'd seen at its darkest. Maybe the world doesn't understand love as well as it thinks it does. Maybe there are kinds of devotion that can't be measured by conventional rules. The evening light was fading now, painting their small home in shades of gold and amber. Clara rose to light the oil lamp they'd brought from Colorado, its familiar glow creating a circle of warmth that held all three of them safe. "She'll never know the Colorado mountains," Clara said, a note of sadness creeping into her voice. "She'll never see the place where her parents found each other. She'll know other mountains, Mexican mountains, with their own beauty and their own stories." Jacob moved to close the shutters against the cooling night air. "And maybe someday, when she's grown with children of her own, we'll tell her about a place called Colorado, where two people learned that love was stronger than law." Clara nodded, accepting the bittersweet truth of it. Their daughter would grow up Mexican in all the ways that mattered: language, culture, faith, identity. But in quiet moments like this, when Spanish gave way to English, and Juan and Maria remembered they'd once been Jacob and Clara, she would inherit something else as well. The knowledge that love could survive anything if it was fierce enough, determined enough, willing to pay any price. A year later, they would receive news through Running Bear's network that the last of the bounty hunters had given up the search. 2 years after that, Clara would give birth to a son they'd name Samuel, after the grandfather who'd carved crosses from mountain pine and taught his children that family came before everything else. 5 years after their escape, Jacob would build a small trading post that became the heart of their growing community, his reputation for fairness and strength drawing people who needed someone they could trust in a hard country. But those were stories for other days, other moments. Tonight, in the fading light of their first summer in Mexico, two souls who'd found each other against impossible odds sat together with the child who proved their love had created something beautiful rather than damned. Martha stirred in her mother's arms, her dark eyes opening to focus on the faces above her. For a moment, 3 generations looked at each other, the innocent child who would grow up free, the dangerous woman who'd fought her way to redemption, and the man who'd chosen love over everything else the world held sacred. "What do you see when you look at us?" Clara whispered to their daughter. "Do you see people who broke every rule to find happiness? Or do you see parents who loved each other enough to face hell itself?" The baby's response was a soft sound that might have been contentment or wonder, or simply the comfort of being held by people who would protect her with their lives. But in that small sound, Jacob heard something else. The promise of a future where their choices would be justified not by the world's judgment, but by the life they'd built from the ashes of everything they'd lost. Outside, the Mexican night settled over their small corner of paradise, while inside the adobe house, 3 people who'd found their way home, despite every obstacle, prepared for sleep. The wooden cross lay on the table nearby, worn smooth by years of handling, its simple lines catching the lamplight like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new moments when love would demand its price. But they would face them together, as they'd faced everything else, with determination born of desperate need and devotion that had already survived the worst tests imaginable. The cradle rocked gently in the evening breeze, carrying their daughter toward dreams of a future bright with possibility. And in that simple sound, pine wood creaking softly in the darkness, Jacob and Clara heard the echo of their father's hands shaping something beautiful from raw material, creating with patience and love a gift that would outlast the maker. Some things were worth any price, even damnation itself. And some forms of love were strong enough to transform hell into home, exile into sanctuary, sin into the foundation for something pure and lasting and good. The child slept, secure in the knowledge that she was wanted, protected, cherished beyond measure. Her parents watched over her rest, guardians of innocence they'd paid for with blood, and choices that would haunt their dreams, but never their hearts. They had chosen each other. They had chosen love. They had chosen family, and in the end, despite everything the world might say about the rightness or wrongness of their path, that choice had led them here, to this moment, this place, this perfect small life that proved love could indeed conquer all. Even when it wore a face the world refused to recognize as righteous. The lamp burned low as night deepened over Mexico, but the light it cast was warm enough to hold back any darkness that might threaten their hard-won peace. They were home now, finally and forever, in the only place that had ever truly mattered, in each other's arms, with their child safe between them, surrounded by love that had survived every test and emerged stronger on the other side.